Welcome to section 3 of the Building RESTful APIs in Go. In this section, we are going to create the core of our functionality, namely the part of the API that responds to actual requests. However, before we do any coding, we need to define the API functionality, which is the topic of this video. Regardless of the scope of the project, a similar specification is always needed, both for the developers and for those who will be accessing the API. Our sample API is going to consist just of the access and manipulation of the list of users in a fictional development company. A given user will be having a name, a role, and of course their unique ID. As far as the expected functionality goes, most of the time it comes down to what is called CRUD: create, read, update, delete. It means that we need to add new records to our data, retrieve one or more records, modify or remove them. RESTful APIs have developed several conventions about practical implementation of this functionality. Each of the operations should be serviced by a separate endpoint, which is a combination of the URL and an HTTP method. However, all operations that access a single resource, in our case the list of users, should have the same URL prefix. In our case, the prefix is going to be just /users. It is also customary to use lowercase prefixes. A single element of our resource is called a document or an item, and the whole list is called a collection. I will be using this terminology from now on. The data format should also be standardized. Some APIs handle more than one format, for example both JSON and XML. For the sake of simplicity, our API will only accept and output JSON. As far as how to perform each operations, there are pretty strict guidelines on how the RESTful API should be accessed and what the output should be. Let's go over them one by one. To create a document, we should use the post method to the resource URL. The content of the document should be a properly formatted item. In the case of success, our API returns the status code 201 and a header with the location for the created item. To access the collection and retrieve the list of available documents, we use the get method on the resource URL. The response should be the list of items and the status code 200, signifying a successful operation. To access an individual item, we need to know its ID and then construct the URL with it. Customarily, this is often written as, for example, /users/ID. There are several things we can do with an item. To retrieve it, we use the get method on the item itself. The response should be 200 and item content in the response body, or 404 if an ID is incorrect. To update an item by replacing its content, use put method and pass the full new item content in the request body. The response should also be 200 and the new item content, or 204 if the content is not sent. Also, sometimes you can allow put to create an item with a given ID. In this case, return 201. We are not going to do this, preferring to return 404 if the item is not found. To update by modifying the content, use patch method with only the updated fields in the request body. As with put, return 200 and the new item content, and 404 if the ID is invalid. Finally, to delete an item, just use the delete method with no body. The API should return 200 if the operation was successful, and 404 if the ID is invalid. Apart from these cases, the following general rules should be adhered to. A malformed request should return code 400. Bad request. Errors in running the program return code 500. Internal server error. If a resource is available but a method is not allowed, it should return 405. Method not allowed. A missing resource should always return 404 not found. I know it's quite a lot to remember. This is why we are creating the documentation in the first place. If you need a reminder or want to read more about the RESTful APIs, you can visit, for example, restapitutorial.com. It's a small, handy resource containing the most important information on just a couple of pages.